All right. Well, I am really excited today to be with Lisa Norton, and I was just saying to Lisa that I'm trying to learn how to be more casual on my own podcast, but I will mention I'm Seth. This is the Embodied Dialogue podcast, and first of all, welcome, Lisa. Glad you're here.
Thank- Glad to be here, Seth. Thank you.
Yeah. And I'll just introduce you by way of how I know you. Really, what I'm hoping to do is find out all the stuff I don't know. But we both recently were participating in an online event in what some people call the liminal web. I guess that just means the part of the internet where people are doing things a little differently or something like that. It was called Limicon, and there was a series of workshops. Basically, all the participants were invited to give workshops. So you gave a workshop, I gave a workshop. I don't think we were in the same workshop, but someone who regularly attends the gathering that you've been hosting for a number of years called Uncertainment Lounge, Kim, came to one of my workshops and said, well, you should come to Lisa Norton's Uncertainment Lounge. And so I really love the Uncertainment Lounge, but before I say more, since people are maybe going to listen in, can you just tell us what is the Uncertainment Lounge? And I can share later my own impressions of it, but where does it come from? And just whatever you want to share from there. And obviously you've lived a whole lifetime before the Uncertainment Lounge that led up to it. But however much detail you want to go, I think the Uncertainment Lounge is really, I'll just say, really important. People might say, that sounds like a funny thing they're doing, but I think it's really crucial. And that's what I'm hoping to unfold. So I'll turn it over to you, though, for a description of the Uncertainment Lounge.
Thank you, Seth. It's great to be here with you. And yeah, let's see. I think what I'm noticing, what I'm sensing, but we haven't really explored in dialogue is how our mutual curiosities overlap. So I've really appreciated that you've been joining us for several of the recent Uncertainment Lounges. It's an emergent dialogue space that meets a couple of times a week on Mondays and Thursdays. My curiosity, though, is to maybe we can unfold some of that today, what it is about somatics and getting a new experience and perspective on how we move and how we interact. I think that might be one of our key commonalities. So kind of like foreground that up front. And then, what is it? It's part of this, in a big picture, I believe it's being called forth, evolutionarily speaking, by our liminal, challenging times.
Mm.
We can debate. There is an active debate about whether, in calling this a meta crisis, we bring that forth and that entanglement of intention and being. So there's lots to say about it, but yes, I think it's an evolutionary impulse and a planetary movement of learning, human learning and adaptivity to, if modernity optimized us for certain advantages, and as the famous saying goes, what got us here may not get us where we want to go.
Yeah.
So in a way, if modernity foregrounded certain forms of control, certain forms of consciousness that optimize for control and mastery, let's say, in the form of ways of being secure, easeful and convenient, comfortable, there's an art of finding that sweet spot between reactivity and response to what's coming toward us and what we're reaching for. So those dispositions and gestures, I think, is what is being practiced across a lot of these different, there's this flowering of interest in emergent dialogue space, we space, circling, authentic relating, emergent dialogue, circling dialogos, it just goes on and on, collective presencing. So
Actually,
uncertainment,
pause you on this for a moment.
sure.
Just being that I suppose that I qualify as a member of this liminal web or something, I feel like you just said a lot of things that I can easily nod my head to, but I also interact every day with people who I don't have these kinds of conversations with. So just to slow down, when you say this emergent dialogue space, I'll say a little of what I think that means and why, if someone had never been in a conversation like we're having, why that would be important. But I'm also curious to get your take. But what I think you just did, even though you talked about an evolutionary take, and there were a number of words that I could imagine someone saying, oh, well, this is really far out. Like, this is really, doesn't have a lot to do with, day-to-day life. But what I would say is, like, actually, if you read the news, day-to-day life is like, oh my God, what's happening to the climate? Oh my God, what's going to happen in the next election? Oh my God, what's happening with this conflict and that other conflict in this other country getting involved? And like, oh my God, what's happening with my kids? Oh my God. And it's like uncertainty is everywhere. And
Right.
so my experience of the Uncertainment Lounge is partly that it's felt like a home, because it's kind of like the place where everyone does see the elephant in the room and we talk about it. So, but then emergent dialogue is also, just more generally, to again, to highlight that, is like just gatherings of people talking where we don't kind of have a script or necessarily, we really want to see where it goes, and we assume there's value in that. So I just wanted to kind of pause on that much, and I know there's more to say, but I'll give it back to you.
Yeah, thank you. And let's keep doing that, because, slow me down, or let's take a moment to stay coherent. So thanks for that direction. Yeah, so I would say, I have a personal origin story about why it made sense for me and what I wanted to bring to it. And I could say a little bit about that. And so I would just say, to make a bridge from what I said before, exactly, we're due to accelerating technology, due to the ease of having instantaneous communication and news feeds of everything going on globally simultaneously. We are absolutely awash in this feeling of uncertainty. And I would say that our modern minds, our modern ways of knowing, in making certainty central in importance, in really cherishing certainty over and mastery over almost anything else, there's been, some unintended consequences of that. So we're not aiming to, mount an attack on rationality or on propositional knowing, but we are saying that some forms of knowing are maybe over dominant, such as propositional knowing is what's rewarded. And I think as a consequence of that habituated favoring of the propositional mind, uncertainty has come to feel scarier for us in modernity and postmodernity. It's as if, wow, knowing and mastering and commanding our world has come to be so central in the scientific method, for example. that we can have multidimensional reactions to not knowing. So the opportunity uniquely of the Uncertainment Lounge is to say, let's get together and reboot our relationship with not knowing and with uncertainty. Can we actually cultivate a rich, let's just say, friendship with uncertainty, so that when uncertainty comes at me, you know, it transfers ideally into daily life. It's not just a practice space for a privileged few. Ideally, it would transfer and have knock-on effects. And maybe, you know, so I think, so there's a lot of commonality with the impulse to learn to interbe and relate transjectively, as John Vervaeke would say, where that subject, object, self, other line is blurring, and we're playing with paradox. We're playing and improvising in that paradox that, yes, we know we're an individual self in some sense, and we also feel ourselves to be the generative field that we're in. So we extend the self and we soften some of our edges around what I know. So the simple injunction of so we basically, in this broad planetary movement of curiosity, that what if we space practices, these practices of emergent dialogue, were the norm in 50 years? What kind of a world would we have? I think that's the vision and the promise.
Yeah.
And then in that sea of variety, wonderful flourishing of these varieties of dialogue practices, the Uncertainment Lounge is kind of zeroing in on really the problem of mastery and expert culture and its unintended consequences. If I'm socialized and rewarded to show up bulletproof and completely knowing what I'm talking about and infallible, gee, how vulnerable are we really?
Right.
Ironic. Donald Rumsfeld said that famously, that and many great sages through the ages have talked about, you know, the only constant is change, and uncertainty as a deep well of wisdom. So we're trying to plumb that well in a practical, you know, real world way.
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned John Vervaeke, and I already said to you earlier in this conversation that when I came to Uncertainment Lounge, I kind of felt at home. So one of the big ideas that Vervaeke talks about, and he has this series Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, where he sort of goes back to the Greek philosophers, comes all the way to today, but he really fleshes out this experience of nihilism, like this sense that, you know, life is kind of meaningless, or, you know, especially if you, like me, grew up in a paradigm that was totally atheist. It's like life sucks, then you die. That's what kids used to say, you know, or maybe say that now even more. But there was this sense of like homelessness, of real homelessness. And when you were talking about the Uncertainment Lounge, it's funny, it came to mind, like, you know, if you're traveling in a foreign country, and actually you're in El Salvador, which is not where you're
Yeah.
you're from. So I would love to hear some of the more personal story of your uncertainties that led you to where you are today. Um, but if you think of like traveling abroad and everything is different, you know, and new, and it could be exciting, but it could also be profoundly disorienting. And then let's just say you're stumbling around in some tourist spot and you bump into someone else who's from your country, right? And suddenly it's like, now we can talk about, you know, if it's me, not my experience of being, let's say last year I was in France. But if I'm with another American, it's like, oh, what's it like for us Americans to be here in France, right? The funny thing about the Uncertainment Lounge is I feel like it does that by saying, what you just talked about, this emphasis on certainty and mastery, or even this idea, I have to be bulletproof. Like if I think about something crucial to my survival, like a job interview, I'm supposed to show up and know everything and have a perfect record of achievement. And I'm supposed to, like, not cough at the wrong time. I mean, it's just like, it's so tense. And of course, there are people who that's their area of mastery. They know how to do it. But I think for many of us, we just walk through life with imposter syndrome all the time. And then when you come to the Uncertainment Lounge, I kind of feel like it's like you're in that foreign country where everything looks unfamiliar. And then everyone in the lounge kind of says, oh yeah, we're not bulletproof either. And then it's suddenly like, oh, we can talk about all the stuff that we were supposed to keep hidden. That's really my experience in the Uncertainment Lounge. And I just want to, again, I'm a little mindful of people listening, just to make it very concrete. My first experience coming to the Uncertainment Lounge, what happens? I log in, there's a Zoom screen with maybe somewhere close to a dozen people on it. And Lisa begins by basically offering us a meditation so that we can ground, but sort of helping to also presence the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty in our lives. And then sometimes you begin with a reflection. The most recent gathering that I went to, you just sort of said, okay, the space is open. But whether you share something personal of your own or not, if you do share something personal, you typically say, no one has to respond to what I just said. You can bring up anything. And then it's just, there's this open space where people are invited to speak. And there's also a lot of silence that can take place, which is, I think, really important. But so anyway, a few more of my thoughts on this.
Yeah, thanks for painting that picture. And I would add that, yes, we, in terms of how it works and feels, that's, I think, the most important ingredient for me. And it's one that I felt that your movement lab shared. It is the granting one another and ourselves this gift of no expectation to know or to be anything in particular.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there, and in your lab, I experienced in a physical way, I was being invited to make some new moves and to observe myself, observing and feeling and everything, that the whole arising of those new moves. So similarly, we, unlike other emergent dialogue practices where there are usually quite defined heuristics and norms for the rules of play, we are keeping those as absolutely minimal as possible in order that we really walk our talk with respect to we're being an Uncertainment Lounge, and those procedures and rules are what the mind is seeking to look for. How can I master this? How can I, show up bulletproof here? How do I game the game in the Uncertainment Lounge? So that's why we keep the rules of play minimal, because we trust that the patterns of learning will emerge over time. So let me give you an example. So each time it's a random assortment of people. So the unique field that's getting generated will invoke its own rules and boundaries. So we just trust that the wisdom of the field is going to emerge. So what that requires, though, is skillfulness. It does require, it's an acquired, and this gets back to your original question, but it's an acquired taste, we might say, for those who are weary of the formulaic, algorithmic nature of modern life. And they're saying, gosh, there's got to be something, there's got to be, a pony hidden in uncertainty somehow. So we trust that wisdom will bubble up. So our basic injunction is just to refrain from certainty and advice giving,
Mhm.
which of course is easier said than done. So regardless of whether the participant is very, very experienced in these kind of spaces, they'll have a different kind of skillful means challenge
Mhm.
in the Uncertainment Lounge. And a novice has a different sort of challenge to just perhaps to even abide in the amount of silence that gets generated. Because
Yeah.
sometimes that silence can have a question mark on it, and the mind is seeking for what does it mean? So we gently, we try to create, yes, we want to have a safe container, but we are gamifying that edge of uncertainty. So it's tricky. It's not for everybody. But those that do benefit from it come back again and again. And we've had a dedicated core group for more than 3 years now. Just to say briefly, the origin story was, it got started as the Uncertainty Lab in the context of the university where I was working and teaching in New York, the New School at the
Right.
Parsons School of Design. And it was, the pandemic created a rupture in the normal way of doing business, and it had the Uncertainty Lab suddenly make sense.
Right.
I was invited to offer it as a co-curricular experience
Mhm.
for faculty and students and staff.
And
So
you
it
were
became
teaching
this.
visual art?
Say that again?
Just to get a little bit of background, you were at the New School, you teach visual art, or what were you doing?
Yeah, my background is in fine arts and sculpture primarily, and I think the best way to say it, world crafts. Really what I was interested in is daily life, human interaction, and haptics. So in that sense, my interests have not changed at all. I was always interested in that unbroken cultural thread of being in the world
Mhm.
and the human artifacts that demonstrate our humanness and how those rituals and practices came about, those patterns. That's my key interest.
Hmm. When you say haptics, I think of how our smartphones like vibrate when we touch them. But I don't think I
Exactly.
knew that word before. But what does haptics mean to you? What's your like?
It
What
means,
vibrate?
yeah, well, I think you probably have anybody who is a fan or a participant in these emergent dialogue spaces is aware on probably several levels that often Zoom space can be more intimate and more instructive and in depth for connecting than face to face.
Hmm.
We can do unconsciousness face to face in real life or online, and vice versa. So we're getting a different valence on, I think what we're learning, some of these virtual technologies are teaching us a lot about the multidimensionality of telepresence and virtual space. So, and
You were saying that my Zoom screen was doing crazy things.
and you did like a magical demonstration
Yeah,
of
yeah, it
my
was all planned.
point.
It was all
So
planned.
the way we're always tracking the the subtle interactions, the energetics of the space, how the field feels
Right,
somatically, what's arising in the body, and all of this. So the
right.
multidimensionality is what was always moving me was that. And in terms of my own story, I got advice from a dear friend of mine in working through, my own childhood patterning. It was, I knew that I had developed a sensitivity as a highly sensitive person. I did have the capacity to be oriented externally, and that, you know, for better or worse. And I noticed that I could be in service to others as a listening field, as an open, non-judgmental presence. And my friend urged me to run with Uncertainment. You know, he said, that is what you do. So why not, you know, as Hunter S. Thompson said, when the going gets weird, the weird go pro. So, you know, so that was the kind of backstory
So
of, you know,
what's,
that aha.
sorry, I had to jump in.
Please.
Uncertainment seems to be a blend with the word entertainment. So as opposed to just calling it, I guess the first version was the Uncertainty Lab, but what's the uncertainment? Is it just a way of kind of nudging people and saying, actually, this is cooler than you think. You should come hang out in this place of not knowing? Is it something like that?
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly. You know, in the context of the university, salience looks like a lab, because that's what everybody does. That's what everybody
Varsity,
has.
of course, is the place where you want to show how much you know, and
Right, it's the identity form of the university. So when I left university teaching and went independent a few years ago, I had to rebrand it for being in the wild. But exactly what you said, you know, to highlight that, you know, we know that we learn best when we're having fun through enjoyment, play, pleasure, engagement, interaction, improvisation. So those are the themes that kind of surround the intention to, you know, take the sting and the stigma out of being uncertain and friendly it and get closer to it and get to know it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, what you just said just sounded to me like a encapsulation of what it means to be a child. You just said we're having fun, you know, and we're and again, I think when I sometimes think, you know, because children get romanticized and why can't we be like children and stuff, but they simply have less fear of looking silly, or less fear of less of a like a projection that I will be judged if, you know, I don't demonstrate certain capacities in this moment. There's just a there's less inhibition. And again, this feeling of home I get in the Uncertainty Lounge is this sense of saying, you're not being asked to do impossible things here, which is frankly how I experience a lot of my life. Even just like, I don't know, some of the things around, you know, running a business, or, you know, the fact that I market what I do, and like, you know, I've got to be an expert when I'm marketing. And it's like, well, actually, um, I've always appreciated the teachers that I had the most, who were like, yeah, we're learning too, and we're all learning together. Let's make mistakes and see what mistakes show us, you know. But that, and it's funny, it feels like such common sense to say this, and yet it really, we live in a culture that it's like it tries to push that really to the side. Like it's, you know, we can romanticize kids, but you've grown up now, so stop acting that way. And so yeah, I think there's this freedom that comes in, which might be the part that feels childlike too. It's like, oh, this is what it's like to just express myself and not worry if I'm doing it correctly. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and just lastly, you referenced early on somatics and like what I do. So the workshop I did at Limicon that you came to, it was called Coming Home to Your Body, and basically I offered an awareness through movement practice, which comes from the Feldenkrais method. And part of what I've been doing here in the liminal web, or whatever we call this, is because when I started with that practice, which generally speaking, the world is framed as like, here's how to move better, here's how to eradicate difficulties and pain. Like, my first draft understanding of what I was doing with the Feldenkrais method was not totally disconnected from this idea of I'm gonna eventually be bulletproof. I'm just gonna do the Feldenkrais method until my body is a bulletproof body and I move perfectly and I no longer say dumb things in conversations and I'm always cool, calm, and collected. And that was really kind of what I was hoping for a while. But that's impossible. And ironically, to the degree that Feldenkrais, and I would extend this to what happens in the Uncertainment Lounge. The reason that people shift and actually feel improvements and feel that things, to some degree, I'll just be very general, get better, it's because I think we're allowed to actually immerse ourselves in the feeling of making a mistake, or the feeling of, but not shy away from it, actually look at it. And then there might be something in there that will become certain because I just paused long enough to actually look at it. I mean, I think a lot of the uncertainty is because that stuff in my blind spot, I'm afraid to turn and look at it. Like, some of what happens in the Uncertainty Lounge is I feel a little more certain about certain things, but it's infinite. There's always more uncertainty. We're not going to run out, so I think that's a bit of the connection. And in terms of somatics, it's like, you can explain something to me, like a mathematical equation that I couldn't solve, and then you explain it to me. It's like, oh, now I know how to get the answer. But there's something different when you just name something that I think about or feel all the time, but no one else named. And then I get to go, oh, you understand too. And it's like something happens in my body. So it's not the same as 2 + 2 = 4. It's like, oh, now I can breathe a little more because you said that. And that's I think the somatic piece, and the maybe even broader into this, as you said. I loved when you said, what if in 50 years it's a normal thing for people to sit around and do this kind of thing? Because I think what we find, even though we don't fully understand what we're doing, is that, oh my gosh, there's so much richness and potency just waiting to be tapped here if we, drop the part where we're supposed to know everything and be bulletproof.
Oh, I mean, absolutely. You just said so much, Seth. There is, exactly. It's an infinite game.
Yeah, yeah.
In James Carson's sense, and there is no balcony in Ron Heifetz's sense. It's all dance floor. He uses the
Explain that a little
illusion.
more, just 'cause I'm not familiar with the references.
Yeah, Ron Heifetz of Harvard had that, and that model of the balcony and the dance floor. So, for example, and that where the balcony signifies reflection, action and reflection cycles, engagement, and then zooming out and seeing the whole system, seeing ourselves entangled with others in our responses and so forth. But the reason I say that is that, so for example, this goes back to making our own rules, and why that's so exciting is that it's like being in a relationship and waking up every morning and saying, I'm recommitting to you. I'm rebooting this from scratch, and wow, let's do this, with no, not carrying anything forward. We want those minimum number of assumptions about how the space is supposed to feel, in order that what you just said, that human possibility surprises us and shines forth, and we get to witness those magical moments. And I want to double click on what you said about, well, first, let me say, we teach what we need to learn. And in this lifetime, what I'm learning to do is to play. I grew up too fast, and I stayed safe and secure. And I had a lot of successes that I'm proud of based on propositional knowing and the ways that I could conform to that way of being. Academia was a great context for me, but I wasn't fully expressing my being. So knowing that, the limits of knowing that, there's a way in which propositional knowing and the limits of language are the limits of my world, and all of that is so operationalized and gamified in the Uncertainment Lounge. So it's really an invitation to say, Nope, there is no balcony here. If you opt into the practice, then you're opting into, if your needs aren't being met, then you grant yourself permission to unmute yourself and speak what you need, whether it's attention or a preference or a way that you're diverging from the direction of the conversation, or maybe it's a request for some silence.
Mhm.
So a kind of a wheel of consent for dialogue,
Mhm.
if you will. But what you said about belonging, I think, is so important. I would say participatory knowing is dominant in the lounge, or because we have so little framework for people to kind of hold on to, other than staying with their own uncertainties and honoring that there's a pony in there somewhere. There's if I can see that not as a limitation, but as a doorway
Mhm.
into something I never knew about myself, or a risk I can take, and to experience the exhilaration of knowing other sides of myself
Mhm. Mhm.
in a socialized way,
Yeah.
in the extended field, and seeing what happens and getting that feedback and just being in the play of receiving how we are being received.
Mhm.
So it's
I'm
very yin. It's very yin practice also.
Mhm. Mhm. As we've been talking, I've been tuning in a couple times to just the flow of our conversation that we're in, right? And there was a couple times where I felt our rhythms slightly different, and then I felt myself invited like into your rhythm, which felt a little slower than mine. I'm very excited to be talking to you, but I also know in myself that my excitement, one of the ways it manifests is, well, I could just now talk for an hour without breathing, and say everything that comes to mind. And, of course, I guess that possibility is nothing wrong with, but at a certain point, if we do that, right, if we monologue forever, then we don't have dialogue, right? And we're sort of taking the space, as we say. But this is what you were just talking about, that feeling of being in the Uncertainment Lounge. I think it really makes tangible this thing that we call space. And space we tend to think of as it's nothing. It's the air that doesn't have anything in it. But this phrase, which is often associated with emergent dialogue, the we space, it's like, so we're on Zoom, but even imagining we were in the same room, there would be a certain amount of air. There would be a certain amount of quote unquote nothing between you and I.
Yeah.
But just the fact that we're facing each other, all that space in there feels different, or, like we did in my workshop. I often use this example. It's like, to my left, there's a wall pretty close by. To my right, the wall's further away. That feels different
Yeah.
than this does. But in an interpersonal space, as you pointed out, whoever shows up in the space changes it. And then it's like each word that each person says potentially changes it. And then what really struck me is you said something, I think, a minute ago about the feeling of speaking, right?
Mhm.
And we often hear this, like, it's kind of a cliche in therapy and stuff, like, I'm afraid to take up space, or you need to learn to take up more space, or, and so, but this is a place where our somatic experience and our psychology, come together. And I've had the experience at the Uncertainment Lounge of both worrying that something I say is going to take up space, and then sometimes after I speak, discovering that, oh, people were glad that I quote unquote took the space, or the space opened, there was more space than I knew, or, like this, this thought that if I say too much that I've taken over the space or something. And yet what's explicit in how you welcome people in is just because I said a whole bunch of things, no one actually has to do anything with it. They can just go somewhere else. So there's this,
Yeah.
I think it sort of shows up that the idea that I'm taking up too much space and the idea that I don't know how to take it, like both of those can actually be just stories I'm telling myself. And it's just very, I mean, now I'm feeling myself starting to even like trip over my words as I'm trying to, but this is actually feels a little bit like what the lounge is about. It's like, oh, I have permission to kind of try to express something that I'm not sure about. And then people are like, I kind of understand. And that kind of is actually has an incredible value. It's not the 100% bulletproof thing, but it's like there's a kernel of something, and then we just we pass it on.
And I think this is the, I mean, again, you just said so much. Let me try to make a few cogent comments. One of the brilliant, John Vervaeke's popularization of the 4 ways of knowing is so useful, right? Because each way of knowing, it does solve for different things. It has different cares and spheres of care and concern, we might say. So there is, on the one hand, we could say the Uncertainment Lounge is a trust space where we destigmatize and heal from the shame of, it's a shared wound that we don't know. And it's normal for human beings facing a complex reality not to have the answers, but yet we have this shared fiction that we ought to know. And that's really that's the
Right.
risk aversive, risk mitigating perspective that Donald Rumsfeld was making in his quip about the known knowns and the unknown knowns. You know, it's all about strategic risk mitigation. So yeah, I think that's right. We're socialized into this world where we're rewarded for that certainty, and yet we all live with the truth that to wonder and to participate with our own learning in real time is the human condition. So we make that discussable in the Uncertainment Lounge, you might say. And you hit on this idea that as a consequence, we fall into unshakable knowing. We light on those magical moments of even collective knowing and something, a larger truth emerging among us. And those are moments that everyone feels in the field, generally speaking. There's a you know, an electricity to the, but we also witness individual genius. And this is kind of what I want to double click on from what you just said. In your somatic practice, I have that experience of, oh, permission has been granted to move in a way that might never have even occurred to me.
Yeah.
It's not within my repertoire.
Right.
And that's very much what I'm trying to cultivate in the lounge. So for example, where in some emergent dialogue, you know, each of those emergent dialogue spaces has its own unique, you know, gifts and learning space, right? Learning culture. And many of them optimize, like say Bohm dialogue has very, you know, well-articulated rules of play. And it's easier to research and study outcomes in that way. But because with the Uncertainment Lounge, I'm really wanting to gamify the very construct of mastery and control via certainty. it's very important to have minimal rules. So let's say someone would come in and say, I'm, you know, I'm a total veteran of uncertainty. I thrive. I eat uncertainty for breakfast. Then their challenge would be to double down on find that part within themselves that can be certain, that can be bulletproof, and just to work their edge wherever they might find it, right? So that's why and also it's the synergistic effect of all of us. First, we're granting one another the mutual regard, unconditional regard of show up however you are, because we are all adults and we can have a response to however we trust that we will have a wise response, or we will endeavor to do so. And that way, what I'm trying to point to is the generativity of the interaction of all of us actually being all in to participatory knowing in an ensemble setting is incredibly unlocking.
Yeah.
So a lot of, magical things happen. So sometimes it will feel, there will just be long pauses, sometimes powerful enough to bring tears for a couple of us. And other times we'll go in a very thinky, philosophical, linguistic direction. And that it's all okay. So the distinction in the lounge is that we were dancing in the interbeing and the interplay between first, second, and third person perspectives, between different ways of knowing. We're getting very curious about the edges between those subject positions, rather than nothing. So nothing is incorrect. So that way, if someone comes in and shows up in a little bit more, expert way, coming across with a lot of declarative statements, that's okay too. It's just it's something else for us all to observe and reorient around. If that helps.
Yeah, totally. Something you said I was looking at your website before, and just with a nod to people watching, I definitely would love to put a link so that people, if they're enjoying the conversation, they can come experience the Uncertainment Lounge. But I was just looking, your website is called Practices of, and I just thought there's so many really wonderful things that you've written there, but I thought I would maybe just read some of what you wrote, and then just for fun, and then you could maybe riff on it a little further.
Sure.
You said here, uncertainty has become our new planetary normal. We live in a time of exponential suffering and grave existential risk. Our ability to survive, let alone thrive, may depend on how we play with differences, both within us and between us. And yet these very challenges invite our fearless creativity and bold new ways of being, knowing, and making. And I'm not going to read everything, but there's something, like, again, if anyone's sort of listening and saying, well, why do this? You said something that I think, well, there's a number. Let me just read another piece. There's a number of good things, but how might collective practices of uncertainment help us build our capacity to participate with the unknowable and the uncontrollable? And I think everyone knows there's plenty of unknowable, uncontrollable forces in our lives these days. Again, you wrote, becoming curious about our uncertainties may help us overcome our reluctance to collaborate with people we are different from in meaningful societal change. Yeah, that's the piece I wanted to underline. So even if you're thinking, this sounds awful, I don't want to do that, that wouldn't be, like, even if we just step back and said, why is this useful? You wrote something there, but do you want to elaborate more on, like, One of the questions I wanted to ask you, and maybe we could broaden it because you've been running the lounge and also observing others, but like, how has this changed you, or for some of the other people who've been coming to the lounge, for a time and have sort of, given you feedback, like what happens to a person by hanging out consistently in this space?
Oh my gosh, you asked such great questions. Thank you, Seth. One of our OG participants has equated the Uncertainment Lounge to a sand mandala that we assemble together in an impromptu fashion on every occasion. And I love that image because I agree that it's the lounge is nothing without those who show up. The lounge is whoever randomly drops into the Zoom call, literally. So every single one has a different flavor, and it embodies this principle of Ubuntu. I am because we are. So for me personally, how it's changed me, and I would say other people might share this opinion, it's validated as legitimate and worthy and valuable my sense, my instinct, my inkling that I cannot truly know myself without you, to be in dialogue or in interaction with me. So it makes that, miracle of existence evident, and it enacts our mutual potential to enliven and acknowledge one another and truly see and witness and hear one another. This grants this great dignity to the other. And I think I want to double back to what you said again. You keep reminding me about the aspect of not having any rules, because there's many layers of that. In the absence of a lot of guidelines that can serve as orienting handholds for the propositional mind, we notice, it prompts a noticing about what assumptions have I brought with me.
Yeah.
Because it forces the participant to fall back on to examine reflectively their own assumptions about what it is to be in dialogue with the other and who the other even is. So it brings this whole space of projection into play. And on the one hand, we can say, it's all projection all the way down, right? And just,
Sure.
pack up our bags and go. But it's much more interesting to try to engage with that paradox.
Right.
Playfully and experience it, right? So in a way, I'm always in the lounge playing with myself. I'm always in this witnessing, but then because we also speak from the collective field, we're just not privileging. So in some emergent spaces, we might say, well, it's about mastering this capacity to speak from the field rather than the individual. It problematizes even that word individual. Maybe individual is the preferred term to denote that we're nothing without the other. We're nothing without culture and our surround, our collective surround. So all these things get activated. And for me, as having had a whole career in fine arts and game-changing humanitarian kinds of artworks and projects and engagements, we know that one of the bottlenecks to a lot of that is the human coordination problem, it's usually called. So I see all these kinds of we space practices as contributing to softening and ameliorating this problem that we're only now learning to coordinate. So that requires seeing my own projections, taking them back to some extent. I don't want it to turn into too much of a fixed psychological interpretation, but working with others with whom we feel very different. In the lounge, we see demonstrated that we're more alike than we are different. And sometimes we can't even ascertain the source of an idea. There's a lot of synchronicity happens, and we begin to participate with the implicate order in ways that we don't quite understand. There's a lot of mystery and magic. So I think so all of that is just to say that we're just honing in on that little corner of the universe that we're not. I would never, for example, want to train the trainers in uncertainment because it's such an absurdity, right? Because with the topic of uncertainty, the harder I try to describe it, the more it withdraws, right? In a Heideggerian sense. So it has that paradoxical quality, the more I try to, and for me as a facilitator, there's a unique challenge because in the absence of rules, we as humans, we model off one another. And I think my dread image of the Uncertainment Lounge is if we became a cohort that had adopted certain mannerisms.
Yeah, right.
But not having dropped into the actual participatory knowing of the thing itself.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. This is really interesting. First of all, I just want to underline one of the things that you've said that I think is just really clear to me about the value of a practice like this is you use the word magical a number of times. And that's the opposite, again, of how nihilism feels.
Right.
If you're just walking down the street and the sun shining is magical, like life has a totally different tone to it. If I talk to you and I look at you and I go, wow, it's another human being with an infinite possibility. Who knows what she'll say next, like, but there's no reason I can't do that when I walk into a store or but we don't for the most part. And we've become very accustomed, again, with technology to sort of be self-sufficient and not interact. And of course, when I'm alone and I, order stuff off of Amazon and I maybe text someone, but if I don't want to reply to their text, I wait 25 minutes to do so. Like all of that is controlled and I'm having an experience that's totally controlled. And of course, that's comfortable in many ways, but it can be that literally when I go to the store, it's almost jarring that the person, who I'm interacting with, and of course, half the time now, at least in the US and here in Washington, D.C., I can just go to the grocery store and a machine can check me out. I actually don't even have to talk to a person even there. But so you started talking about in a kind of a comical way, you said, I don't want to train the trainers. But someone does have to hold the space and that's what you are doing. Although I wasn't able to be a part of it, I know that one of your offerings at Limicon with along with Nick Shore and maybe there was others was about, well, you could say more if you like, but it had something to do with how to hold space. Like this question of space, I think is becoming more prominent, and certainly in the circles that you and I are in, it's very important. It's like because you've said a few times there's no rules, and I keep thinking, well, some people might feel anxious when they hear that going to a place. There's no rules, but Lisa's holding the space, right? Or I think you might even say in the Uncertainment Lounge, everyone's holding the space. But although there's no rules, it's not like people start pillaging. Yeah, because it's like what we discover. And I mean, of course, we know very real. I mean, just think of like what's going on in Haiti right now or something. I mean, it's like you can have situations where there are no rules and bad actors are just taking advantage and no one else knows what to do. But, there's also no rules necessarily on the playground, and kids are making, their own childlike versions of sand mandalas together. And so we can have this possibility. But I laughed to myself when you said, I don't want to train the trainers. So in the Feldenkrais method, which is this practice, right, which has everything to do, as you described, with giving permission to move in a way that a person maybe had never moved before, feel something. And yet, how do you get person into the space of, so that takes some skill. You have to hold space for that. And the funny thing is that when I was in my training, people were always mad at the trainers because the trainers kept sort of emphasizing, well, we don't correct our clients, we don't tell them what to do. And then I remember would happen over and over, because part of the work we do is hands-on, is the trainer would say, let me have a volunteer, and they would lie on the table and they would be explaining, they'd be touching them. They keep saying things like, well, I'm not doing anything. I'm just letting them do what they want. I'm just touching their shoulder because they're already doing that with their shoulder. And I'm not really doing anything. I'm just, I'm going to touch this leg and this one. Oh, this one's lighter. So I'm just lifting it because it's lighter. But then the person stands up totally transformed. And the trainer says, well, I didn't do anything. But all the trainees are like, how did you do that? I want to learn how to do that. And this is this ongoing paradox, because it's like, holding space is this funny thing that you can do skillfully or less skillfully, but the more skillful you are, the less it seems that you're doing. And I just wanted to riff on this a little, partly because, okay, you and I both are involved in facilitation, but I feel like it's a skill that's not just like, oh, listen up if you're a coach, listen up if you're a therapist. It's like, it's part of what we all need to do for each other, is hold space. But
oh my God. Yeah. I mean, you said so much, and I just want to, again, just stop for a moment, just to, thank you for helping me open up insight in my own awareness by asking such great questions, and showing me where I think you're right. To say we have no rules, it's a sloppy way of languaging it. So it really demands a lot more attention. There's certainly skillfulness there, and I see the parallel with what you're doing, absolutely.
Well,
And
I would
also,
even just add, just for a second, when you say no rules, I think probably some people are thinking, great, finally, but another person would get uptight around that. And like, even that difference is something that it's just, so I don't think it's like wrong that you say there's no rules, but I just thought it would be worth underlining that some people might run away from such a description.
It's glossing over something that's very deep and important, I think. So, and procedural knowing comes in there when you talked about tapping the shoulder. There's an embodied knowing, participatory knowing that's happening, and a knowing how that might not be cognized.
Right.
So there's a lot of dot connection that happens. I think Jordan Hall and others coined that word rule omega, Jim Rutt. I think because we have those two meta rules of granting, we opt into the space on the condition that we're willing to participate. That's one meta rule that, so engage, there is no balcony. So if I'm, if I'm suffering during the process of the session because something's happening that I'm not comfortable being with, but I haven't expressed it, I haven't found a way to share that, then I'm not truly participating. And then in contrast, someone might be fully engaged, fully immersed with every moment exquisitely and yet not say a word, but they're still participating, you know? So I think that there's a real demand for skillfulness. So in addition to that first meta rule of I'm opting in, it's kind of my vow to stay awake and participate live, to work live improvisationally. And then the second meta rule would be that granting of one another the dignity and the permission not to know. And I think that is such a powerful rule, because it means I have to grant that to myself first and to everyone in the space. And that it's kind of a, you know, it transmutes shame, I believe. It's permission to let go of any stigma or shame that we might have about not knowing. So I do think that's super, super important. And then getting back to your question about Limicon, it was Alexander Love and Nick Shore and myself who did that strange attraction. It was a series of 3 experiments in, you know, sourcing from the collective itself, from the field itself. What are the learning edges? What are we currently learning across this whole planetary experiment in emerging dialogue practice? What are some of the themes? What are some of the tendencies? What are some of the parameters that we can study further, that demand further study and curiosity? So I'm, as a designer and artist, in a way, that's my abiding interest in humans gathering together to try to coordinate better. That's really what I'm, you know, working in service of.
Mm.
And the problem of, you know, training the trainer, I laugh because I cry, you know. It's a koan that I'm trying to crack. So I am working on projects where I'm trying to bring the, you know, harvest the learning of the Uncertainment Lounge and transfer it to other appropriate contexts, such as contexts of consequence, such as decision making,
Right.
high stakes contexts that demand sacred listening field
Right.
in various ways, so that what the lounge, the spirit of what the lounge is, doesn't need to change, but rather we find the context where the participants already get the value of it.
Right.
Because
Right.
as you say, in our waking normal consciousness, we don't drop into interbeing. It's, you know, it's still something we're working to inhabit together. Again, that principle of Ubuntu. So yeah, so I am interested in all the different collective projects. There are many that are working on kind of the sense making
Yeah.
dimension of, okay, what are the patterns we're starting to see across this huge mega trend, right?
Yeah. Mm. I'm just sort of sensing all that is here that I could hold on to, but it actually feels good to
Yeah.
just pause. Um, yeah. Yeah, this is really wonderful. I thought to myself earlier when I was going to talk to you, and of course I started, you know, imagining some of the threads that we've gone down and whatnot. But I think what really drew me to have this conversation with you is my experience of you is that you're at heart an experimentalist. And that's what really resonates for me. And I think in my own life, some of what's been painful is feeling like there wasn't space to do experiments, you know. and like an experiment, I mean, of course, in the context of modern science, like, there's a glorified version of something that's called the scientific method and hypothesis, etc. But in a much more informal way, we're just learning in life by trial and error. And then I think there's even this way that, as children, we're learning by trial and error, but we don't even need our hypothesis to point towards a potential improvement. It's just like, I want to see what happens, right? Like for me, when I was a kid, and it's still true to this day, but it started in, I'll call it innocence. As a child, I was just interested in language, and so I would speak in tongues all the time as a child, just because it's like, that's cool. There's other sounds besides the ones in the English language that I could make with, and it just, but what I've experienced over the years of playing with that is, on the one hand, if we just use this example of playing with language and saying words that aren't real, it's infinite what you can do. And at the same time, there's a way that someone could look in the direction of that infinity and say, that looks irrelevant. So
Yeah.
why would you do that? There must be something wrong with you, or that's a waste of time, or how does that make any money? And so there's been in my life this experience of incredible value that's to be just harvested through experimentation, along with a sort of, like a injunction against doing that, and I mean, I'm aware I'm going into how this lands for me personally, but I intuit that some of what I'm saying is a more generalized experience out there. Like, just, I can go somewhere and I can mess something up, but I would even say, like, maybe because we're probably going to wrap up soon, but to come back to Uncertainment Lounge, I would also say that not only can we potentially repair some of what hurts when we come in a place like that, but we can really discover capacities so far beyond what we knew was possible, right? Like, just the way that when we are in the Uncertainment Lounge for 90 minutes, and like the moment that we're having right now, you and I, comes, and you might say to people, well, let's take some final shares. And sometimes it's like every word that everyone says in the last 10 minutes just resonates with every other word, and it looks like no one could have planned it, but it has this architecture to it that just, when you sort of like sit back at the end, it's like, wow. So I just kind of wanted to point at that too, because I think that experience also is so nourishing, right? It's like, I personally have the experience of, I'm capable of more than what I knew I was capable of. But you've referred to this, you've used this word Ubuntu a number of times. It's precisely the others there that help me reveal to myself my capacity. So anyways, I want to invite you into sort of the that question of what becomes possible, like,
Yeah.
when we really start finding our way a little bit in this practice.
Right. Thank you, Seth. Right. There's, yeah, that we don't want to, the propositional mind is so incredibly brilliant and useful. And yet, it's, it's extractive in certain ways, and, instrumental in certain ways. And when we can, so in that regard, no matter how I articulate what Uncertainment Lounge is, I'm pointing at the moon. I can't get there from propositional knowing exactly. I can create images and analogies. So yeah, there's something about, I think that would have been another alternate term for the space would have been like Genius Lounge. and I think that's one of the dearest things to me. That's the what's at stake piece, which is that we bear witness to incredible human possibility just shining forth, because we turn the notion of like mistake and failure upside down, and we just get curious about what's going to happen. People surprise themselves with what they dare to speak or gesture toward, so yeah, I think that is absolutely one of the most rewarding things, that the word Ubuntu captures it in a way the best. It's literally a shared capacity. We are developing individual capacities, to be sure, but the synergistic effect of the shared capacity to participate with those patterned vibrations in the field, let's say, and to resonate with them in different ways creates these uncanny magic. Is, I reach for the word magic all the time, because they're surplus, they surpass our expectations about who we are individually and together. And I do think I don't think I'm a big fan of Rudolf Steiner. I think he was on the right track with his theory of the 12 senses. And we don't begin to have adequate taxonomies for our capacities and our sensorium. So it's wonderful just to play in all these kinds of spaces and just extend that learning. So yeah, that is, I think, I hope this kind of thing is the norm. And what's really exciting is like people are just attracted to it, and it's not in language. It's the words that we might exchange I don't want to sound like I'm saying it has nothing to do with language, but there's a way in which the dialogue is a mere carrier wave for some other things that we are working on together.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, we've been in a way pointing at the moon the whole conversation, but yeah, so I really hope that anyone who watched this far will come hang out in the Uncertainment Lounge. Invited a few friends of mine, and I'm kind of disappointed that none of them showed up yet. They see this
So far.
but yeah, I know I'm gonna keep going there, and it really feels like, yeah, just a place of nourishment and a place of self-discovery, and there's this kind of sense of like, I don't know, like a geyser that is this infinite, source of something that keeps coming up from underground. So I really love to be there and kind of drink from that fountain. That's kind of how it feels when I go there. It's just wonderful.
Thank you so much, Seth. And you add so much to it. I mean, that's, tasting all those flavors of embodied knowing is so amazing. It's just an experience. I welcome everybody that's interested to come. You can check it out on my website, www.practicesof.org.
Yeah, and I'll put that, in the caption under the video. And yeah, I would definitely love to talk more. I'm aware of many subjects that we didn't get to. I'd love to just at a certain point get more of the autobiography from you even, but this was a great start. So thank you for being here. Thank you for creating the space for uncertainty, and look forward to doing this again sometime soon.
I loved it, Seth. Thanks for what you do, and look forward to chatting again.
Thanks so much.